Welcome everyone to the PFF Fantasy Podcast. I'm John Macri, joined as always by the Nate, the great Jahnke. Nate, we've spent the last few months of the podcast covering rookies, and more rookies. But with hashtag rookie season wrapped, it's now time to kind of switch our focus toward the 2025 fantasy season, dive into the early ADP and start getting the good folks locked and loaded for fantasy draft season. And we're going to be starting by looking at some wide receivers, Nate. So I guess how are you feeling coming out of rookie season, and are you ready to begin the shift into 2025 mode?
I am. I've been in that shift in my written content for a while now. I've got over 100 player profiles up on the website already, with probably 100-ish more to go. So already well within the first 5, 6, 7 rounds of redraft ready to go. Have tinkered with my rankings every single time. So I'm fairly happy with where I have player 48 versus 49 and that kind of stuff. Where past years, it wasn't until July that I was able to really dive in. So feeling in a good spot here in May.
Nice. Yeah, like to hear that. Yeah, there's all kinds of player profiles on the site right now that you guys can dive into, and we'll talk about a lot of those players here today. And yeah, for podcast wise, like this is kind of our prologue, I guess, to the 2025 season, as we're going to go through some of the, again, early ADP from underdog drafts, which is, it is a best ball format, so there will be some slight differences in how drafts are approached, but for the most part, this ADP is kind of our best indication for how drafters are valuing our 2025 options right now. So Nate, like I said, he's been pumping out all kinds of player profiles on our 2025 fantasy options with a ton of information on each individual player in those pieces. And what I've started doing is finding the closest players in ADP, starting with the wide receiver position and kind of stacking them up head to head, comparing all their key metrics, quarterback situations, target competition, and providing as much data as possible for you guys to make the most informed decisions come draft day as well. And those are free articles that you can check out right now on pff.com. And then that'll kind of be the focus of what we're doing today, because Nate and I are going to go over 5 of those wide receiver battles and give our takes on how these guys all stack up as well. So yeah, that way we're ready here to kind of start putting, again, rankings to get them formed for the 2025 season. Nate's obviously got his up on the site. I need to get mine locked up and loaded here in the next couple of weeks. So we're going to start with the wide receiver 5 versus wide receiver 6 battle. We'll skip over the first 4 wide receivers for now, since there's a little bit more separation in the ADP, with Jamar Chase at 1, followed by Justin Jefferson at 2, CeeDee Lamb at 3, Puka Nacua at 4. So that leads us to going 9th and 10th in the first round of fantasy drafts. So Nate, Malik Nabers versus Amon-Ra St. Brown. Nabers finished his rookie season as the PPR wide receiver 6 from weeks 1 to 17, while Amon-Ra St. Brown finished as the PPR wide receiver 3 for the second straight season. So Nate, this is a battle of kind of high-end consistency in a great offense with Amon-Ra St. Brown versus the bet of elite upside in Malik Nabers. So in the article, they're broken down by a number of different categories to see how they stack up. But anywhere in particular that you'd like to start with these two going near the end of round 1 of fantasy drafts?
Yeah, I think the thing you said about consistency, that was very true for both of these wide receivers in general throughout their NFL careers so far. St. Brown, he has graded between a 90 and 91 receiving grade each of the past couple seasons. So his receiving grade has been consistent. His playing time has increased each of the past couple years, which has been good for him. So peaked in fantasy points per game in 2023. Like you said, a similar rank last year, but his fantasy points per game decreased a little bit. Some of that was just more targets going to other players in the offense stepping up in general. And with St. Brown, that's probably where I'm most concerned about him in general. They have a new offensive coordinator. The coordinator has talked about explosiveness in the offense, has talked about Jamison Williams potentially having a breakout year. Jahmyr Gibbs, another player who is very explosive in the offense. And there are just too many mouths to feed in Detroit. So worried he's going to fall out of those top 5 fantasy wide receivers this year. But I also have a little bit of concern for Malik Nabers. I feel like a lot of people are just viewing Nabers of he's a very good wide receiver and is going to have a better quarterback this year in Russell Wilson. But I think part of having those quarterbacks last year is they force fed Nabers the ball, which helped his consistency. He always had at least 8 PPR points. He was the best in uh, targets per game, targets per route, all of those things. So I think with if Russell Wilson wins the quarterback job, which I expect him to be, Russell Wilson is someone who has had no problem checking down to his running back each of the last 2 seasons with 2 different teams. They had running backs that were near the league lead in targets the past 2 years. And that's because Wilson isn't going to force speed his top receiver like the quarterbacks were last year. So I'm worried that even though the wide receivers are the same in New York as last year, the tight ends are the same as last year, I'm worried that Neighbors might not see as many targets because Wilson is willing to chuck down the ball much more than the past quarterbacks were willing to.
Yeah, that's a fair point, right? Like, I think I'm with you. I definitely think that Russell Wilson brings a very different kind of approach to the passing game as well. But like, I think one of the key areas for me for Malik Neighbors, where yeah, like I think he does have the advantage over Amon St. Brown, is still in just the amount of targets that I think will still be funneled his way primarily. Where, like you mentioned with Amon St. Brown, there's more target competition in that offense. Like Neighbors last year, he ranked second among 130 qualifying wide receivers in target rate, trailing only Puka Nakua in that regard, who had like a 37% target rate. So he doesn't necessarily need to be that high. Obviously, finished second with in the NFL with 133 first read targets as well. Led the league with 11 targets per game as a rookie. I just think that the Giants, they didn't really do anything like at all this offseason in terms of adding pass catchers. So I still think he's going to be in a good position to be one of the league's most heavily targeted players in 2025, even if it isn't as much with Russell Wilson at quarterback. I still think that's an advantage that Neighbors has over St. Brown this year. And it's not to say that St. Brown like wasn't highly targeted in Detroit either. Like he definitely was, and he has been over the past 3 seasons. But yeah, 25% target rate in 2024. That's remained pretty consistent for his career here since 2022. So basically, the difference really between the two is that the Lions are a more balanced attack, right? And they don't need to rely heavily on the pass or on Amon-Ra St. Brown alone to make the passing attack work. So for me, I think that's something that is a big help to Neighbors' potential value, is that that Giants passing attack absolutely needs him to work. The entire offense is probably going to need him for them to have any kind of success. Now, um, when it comes to like the effectiveness of those targets, Amon-Ra St. Brown so far has been the better player. It's only 1 year of sample for Malik Neighbors, but it's why he's been able to finish as the wide receiver 3 in back-to-back seasons. He outperformed Malik Neighbors in yards per route run, receiving grade, separation rate, red zone target rate, first down touchdown rate, all of those things. And that efficiency helps Amon-Ra St. Brown be right now the better wide receiver. But I think, projecting Malik Neighbors for year 2, if he gets a little bit better, I think that should close the gap a little bit more. He's obviously in his prime. And Amon-Ra St. Brown, he's not old either. Like, I want to make that clear. That's not what I'm saying. He's still in his prime as well. He's going to be just 25 years old come week 1, but Neighbors will be 2022 or 2020. He'll be 22 in 2025, but so both guys are really in their NFL prime, but there's potentially more progression still to be made for Neighbors than there maybe is with St. Brown right now. And that's where I think there's this real wide receiver 1 upside for Malik Neighbors. But yeah, like you said, the passing situation, it is different than what it was last year for Malik Neighbors with Russell Wilson. So yeah, I mean, I have a feeling where like I know where I want to go, but there's a lot of different things here to kind of take into account as well with the Giants and the Lions. We haven't even really dove into kind of the target competition in too much detail. Like you said, Jameson Williams could be in for a breakout year, but on the Giants side, Wan'Dale Robinson, like he was a high end target earner for the team last year. He's obviously back this year, but largely due, I think, to just being that more quarterback friendly, low A dot and screen game option for Wan'Dale. Like he had 132 targets last year, which was 14th most among wide receivers, but had the third lowest A dot for the position at 5.1 yards. So he's a key part of the offense, or he was. We'll see what happens this year with Russell Wilson, but it doesn't really affect Malik Nabers' upside, right? Because Wandale finished as PPR wide receiver 37, and Nabers was wide receiver 6, despite missing 2 games, right? They get, it's different targets that the two get. So I'm just not concerned at all about any of the Giants wide receivers eating into the target share from Malik Nabers, where I may be concerned a little bit more of that with the Lions.
Yeah, like, I think it's fair that we talked about their competition for targets last because it really didn't change from last year. It's the same wide
Yeah.
receivers for both teams, same tight ends for both teams, change in the running backs for New York, which might lead the team to run the ball a little bit more often, which is something for the Giants. But, like, even if Darius Slayton all of a sudden had this, what, 6th year breakout or whatever year he's in right now, the Giants can have 2 great targets and still be fine. Like, last year, the duo of Robinson and Nabers had the highest combined target rate of a top 2 wide receiver of any wide receiver duo of the past decade in a season, and Nabers was just fine, so definitely not worried about anyone in New York. And Detroit, I am very worried, which is why I would consider potentially having Nabers ahead, but for me, I think the tiebreaker is the 2 offenses, and knowing that Detroit has one of the best offenses in the league, New York had one of the worst offenses in the league. I'm not sure if that's going to change too much for New York, even with the quarterback change, even adding Cam Scadaboo. There's a world where Detroit's averaging twice as many points per game as New York is this year, and that wouldn't be all that surprising for us. Like, it could be 32 points to 16 points or something like that in terms of points per game. And St. Brown last year, even though he wasn't targeted quite as much, he was scoring more touchdowns, and that was the difference for him. And he was getting more of those red zone targets. So I think even if he continues to lose some target share this year, I think he can still be one of those weapons in the red zone scoring touchdowns for Detroit. So even though I'm a little bit concerned, and both of these guys I have lower than their ADP, the tiebreaker for me is St. Brown because I think he'll be able to score those touchdowns where I don't know how many touchdowns New York is going to be scoring in general, even if he has a higher percentage of the team's touchdowns.
Yeah, it's a good point. I don't think this Giants offense is going to be good. I do appreciate you referencing Cam Scadaboo as a potential for why they could be better. But yeah, like for me, I still like, I don't know. It's a good conversation, and it's why these guys are so close in ADP, because it's gonna, I think, depend almost entirely on how we want to maybe build our fantasy rosters a little bit. And while there's not much like risk in either player, there is like a safe option and kind of the upside option here, right? Where I'm almost always going to take the upside option early and find the safer options to round out my roster later on. So personally, like I prefer Malik Nabers here for now, despite the worst offense, the worst quarterback, and not having the consistency or efficiency of Amon-Ra St. Brown. Like I think there's still more potential for targets with less competition in what I still think will be a more pass heavy offense, especially compared to Detroit, for a player that I think should continue to progress this season. I'm going to lean Nabers here a little bit. So, but I definitely get the argument for Amon-Ra St. Brown. So I could be swayed either way. But yeah, I'll play devil's advocate and give the edge to Malik Nabers here this time.
I would say, like, if Russell Wilson were to suffer an injury or just straight out lose the job, and we
Yeah.
had one of the other quarterbacks as a starter for New York, that would probably be the difference for me of putting Nabers ahead. It's just knowing how much Wilson checks down the ball versus someone like Jameis Winston who's willing to throw the ball deep. And like Nabers, I think can be a great deep option. Just didn't have the quarterbacks to throw to him deep. I think that's one area where I expect improvement this year, even with Wilson, is better deep ball accuracy. But it's just the targets I expect to decrease with Wilson, where I would not expect that target decrease with either of the other quarterbacks, except Dart ends up being the starter as well. So I think if the quarterback changed in New York, I think it's just Wilson's style and knowing Wilson doesn't always throw to the first read, even though we expect Nabers to very often be the first read. I think that would probably be the difference for me between these two.
Yeah, again, I got another good point. I remember when Jameis got signed first, everybody was very excited about Malik Nabers, right? And then there was just this collective sigh when Russell Wilson signed on, because yeah, that high end pass potential just it definitely got cut down a little bit, but yeah, not impossible for it to still work out here in 2025. But all right, we'll move on to our next ADP battle that we have here, and that is between Nico Collins of the Houston Texans and the wide receiver 8, Brian Thomas Jr. Collins was wide receiver 7. So at the end of the very first round, where if you're lucky, and want to, the answer could be both. If for both, you could draft both of these players. But for today, let's pit them against each other. Now, Collins, he dealt with injury last season, so he missed some time, but he finished as the wide receiver 26 overall, wide receiver 8 in points per game. Brian Thomas Jr. was healthy in his rookie year, delivered a wide receiver 5 finish as the top rookie wide receiver among a lot of strong rookie wide receivers. So, both players were the top targets in their respective offenses, with Collins earning an elite 28.3% target rate. That ranked third at the position. And then both players, too, dealt with their target competition, suffering from injuries last year with Stephon Diggs and Tank Dell in Houston. And then Christian Kirk, Evan Ingram, and Gabe Davis all missed a big chunk of games each. Now, Collins, he's been delivering high-end production over the past 2 seasons since breaking out in 2023. He ranked as a top 5 wide receiver in yards per game and yards per route run last year. And his 2.64 yards per route run over the past 3 seasons has him actually tied with Justin Jefferson for 4th at the position over that span. Now, I think, for Brian Thomas Jr., like if I'm going to be optimistic about Malik Nabers, it's hard not to be optimistic about Brian Thomas Jr. as well, because he was the one that led all rookies in yards per route run last season with a 2.64 figure, ranking behind only Puka Nacua for the best rookie mark of the past 3 seasons. So I think there's definitely an argument for both of these guys in this range at the end of the first round of fantasy drafts. There's more I have to say, but Nate, I'll let you kind of cut in here so I'm not just talking nonstop. Go ahead.
There. So both of these guys, I have them in my top 5 wide receivers. I have both of them higher than ADP. So I'm excited about both players and would be happy to have either of them on my roster. Collins, he's graded very well, over 90 receiving grade the last 2 seasons. Has the most fantasy points per route run over these past 2 years. So that has been huge for him. Last year of 19 fantasy points per game. If you remove the games where he was either injured or that last game where they had clinched the playoff spot and they pulled their starters very early. So if you just count the games where he's actually playing the whole game, 19 fantasy points, which is huge. The big thing with him is he's had those injuries, and he's had those injuries every single season. He's missed between 2 to 6 games every year. So I think when Collins is healthy and on the field, he should be one of those top couple wide receivers. It just, when is he going to miss those games? And if they're going to be in the fantasy playoffs, that's huge. Where Brian Thomas Jr., like you said, was top 5 in fantasy points, was a little bit less consistent early in the season, and then later in the season more consistent, which did coincide with the injuries you were talking about, but also you expect rookie wide receivers to improve over the course of their rookie season. So final 7 games, at least 13 PPR points every game, an average of 21.5 over that 7-game stretch. So third behind Chase and Nakua. Um, they did add Travis Hunter, which is probably the big negative for Thomas this year, but I do think the two can coexist just fine. We've seen plenty of cases where 2 receivers are able to have a very high target rate, especially when you don't have a tight end who's going to have a high target rate. I think Strange will be just fine for tight end, but I don't think he's going to be one of these like top 10 targets at tight end. And then similarly, running backs, they have a couple of options. I don't think they have an option that's going to be a top 10 receiving running back. So I think Thomas and Hunter can both see a ton of targets and be just fine that way. And the big reason for optimism for me is they got Liam Cohen as the new head coach. Thomas has been excellent when he's lined up in the slot. He had the most yards per route run out of all the slot receivers last year. And Cohen, last year we saw with the Buccaneers with Chris Godwin, had 19.7 PPR points per game as the primary slot receiver. 2 years before, Cooper Kupp, 22.4 fantasy points per game as the Rams slot receiver. So I think Thomas is the one who will play the most in the slot out of all the Jacksonville receivers. I think Hunter will be more of an outside option for the team. So I think Thomas in that offense, in that role where we already saw him be successful, and we've seen other good wide receivers of similar size, they're all bigger slot receivers in general, be successful. I'm very excited to see what Thomas can do in Cohen's offense in that role after seeing the Buccaneers offense just like completely transform last year under Cohen.
Yeah, it's a good point, right? And if this offense does get better, that obviously could be huge for Brian Thomas Jr. Because last year, like you look at kind of even just the Texans, right? Like they ranked top 10 in the league in red zone plays in 2024, and Nico Collins was like the clear leader on the team in red zone target rate. He had a top 10 mark in that regard among all wide receivers with at least 40 routes, and 5 of his 7 touchdowns came from the red zone. So I'm not expecting like too much change there for Houston, where Jacksonville definitely has room to improve, right? He was obviously the top red zone target rate on the team, but Jacksonville themselves, they only ranked 26th in red zone plays last year. And even with that, he still delivered 8 red zone touchdowns, which was the most for a rookie wide receiver since Odell Beckham Jr. in 2014. So like if Trevor Lawrence can get back on track under Liam Cohen as well, like that could be a big boost to Jacksonville's scoring potential this season and get Brian Thomas Jr. on par with where Nico Collins was in opportunities last year. And even CJ Stroud, obviously there's room for him to bounce back as well, because I don't think it's much of a secret that the Texans are coming off a stronger season than Jacksonville, but they're still both kind of quarterbacks had their struggles last year when they were out there. I think there's still some kind of untapped potential in 2025 on both sides. And Stroud like delivered. He had a top 12 season in PFF passing grade. His accuracy is where I think there was the biggest dip. It ranked outside the top 32 at the position, and he took 63 sacks, which was the second most in the league. So the pressure that he's going to face, I think, could still be there. Houston's offensive line lost, 4 starters this offseason and really failed to kind of make the major upgrades there. So Stroud could be vulnerable again, where, Trevor Lawrence obviously only played in 10 games last year, but there's room that he could bounce back under Liam Cohen. Cohen's offense in Tampa Bay ranked top 5 in both overall offensive grade and passing grade last season. If he can bring even some of that success to Jacksonville, where Jacksonville ranked like 24th and 22nd in those categories respectively, Lawrence, I think, and this passing game could see a pretty significant rebound, which will be very helpful. So yeah, you mentioned, Travis Hunter, there's target competition there. Both teams have rookie wide receiver target competition to deal with. Christian Kirk jumps from Jacksonville to Houston, so he'll be now target competition for Stroud like he was for Brian Thomas Jr. last year. But yeah, I don't think there's any real concerns on either side for these players. Like Travis Hunter can still be a good option for fantasy, but I think there should be room for both players to eat here in Jacksonville if we assume, that Liam Cohen and Trevor Lawrence offense does improve as well. So, Nate, it sounds like you're leaning Brian Thomas Jr. over Nico
Yep.
Collins right now. Is that right?
Yep.
Yeah. I think it's close. I think I do lean Brian Thomas Jr. as well. But it is close. Like I don't mind the call of Nico Collins inside the top 5 where you have him. That's not, right now where he's being drafted. But again, it's early. I think, as we get closer to the season, I could definitely see Nico Collins and both Brian Thomas Jr. being in that top 5 conversation here come draft day. So yeah, like the call, I think I'll probably lean Brian Thomas Jr. as well right now.
One other little thing on Collins before we
Yeah.
jump to the next guys. The Texans did rotate their wide receivers a lot in the past with their offensive coordinator. They changed offensive coordinators this year. I wouldn't be all that surprised if we see Nico Collins on the field more often, therefore running more routes. That might impact his efficiency a little bit whenever you have a higher sample size like that. But I think in general, the more snaps will do him better. So I think that'll lead to more fantasy points. And that's another reason that I'm optimistic about Collins. And compared to like Malik Nabers that we talked about, all 3 young, high upside wide receivers, clear top targets with little competition for targets, and the tiebreaker between the three of them really is the offense of you can see Jacksonville potentially becoming a really good offense with what's going on. You could see Houston potentially having a really good offense this year, and we don't see that with New York. So that's why I have both of these wide receivers above Neighbors.
I like it. Yeah, and look, I mean, like you said, we can, um, I guess, tolerate a drop off in efficiency if it means more volume, right? That is an acceptable trade off. So I'm absolutely with you there. All right, before we go on to the other wide receivers, I do want to let you guys know that this episode is brought to you by Fabric by Gerber Life. Now is still a great time to reevaluate financial goals, not just for yourself, but for your kids. Now is the perfect time to make sure your kids are on a path toward a solid financial future. A kid's investment account from Fabric by Gerber Life is quick and simple to set up and lets you invest in their future now for education, big milestones, and more. Fabric by Gerber Life was designed by parents for parents to make it easy to plan for and manage your family's financial path. With a kid's investment account from Fabric, you can start investing in your child's future today. Kids can't invest when they're minors, but a kid's investment account allows you to invest on their behalf now, giving their investments more time to grow. It's all online, and setting up an account can take you just 5 minutes. Then you can manage your child's account, monitor their investments right from your phone. Funds can be used for nearly anything, benefiting your child from tuition and tutors to music classes, and when they're adults and out on their own, they can use the funds for anything they need. Join the thousands of parents who trust Fabric to help protect their families. Start investing in your child today at meetfabric.com/fantasy. That's meetfabric.com/fantasy, meetfabric.com/fantasy. Portfolios managed by Fort Washington Investment Advisors, Inc. Additional services provided by Apex Clearing Corporation. All investing is subject to risk. Learn more at meetfabric.com. All right. So next up in the ADP battles, well, quickly just to highlight some of the players that are going right before we get into this one. Drake London, AJ Brown, Lad McConkey, T. Higgins were all next in ADP. I did write up London versus AJ Brown, which you can check out for free right now on pff.com. But for the podcast, we're going to move to wide receiver 13 and wide receiver 14, which starts off round 3 of fantasy drafts. That's Garrett Wilson versus Marvin Harrison Jr. Nate, where do you want to start with these two former first rounders in stacking them up?
Oh yeah, we'll start with Wilson. I do find it interesting with these. Sometimes you see differences in underdog and what the rankings are there compared to other places. And I think both of these wide receivers are a little higher on underdog right now. And
Mhm.
I tend to match around where they are at underdog. So hopefully both wide receivers stay relatively lower in other formats so you can draft these wide receivers. But Wilson, I think, is probably the safer of the two right now, just because we know he's the clear top target in New York. They don't have much of any competition for targets for him. They got rid of Devontae Adams clearly, and then Tyler Conklin as well at tight end. So, if anything, he has less competition for targets after already being one of the clear top target earners in the NFL last year. The big thing is just how efficient is the offense going to be? How good are the targets going to be when Wilson is targeted? He has Justin Fields at quarterback now. So we know he's going to get a ton of targets. Just how good of quality are those targets? There's already been some negative buzz about Fields, even though it is extremely early. It's May. There should be time for him to turn that around. But I think this is one where I'm going to be high on Wilson because he's going to have that high target rate, and that gives him a really good floor. And if Fields does better than we expect him to do, then all of a sudden Wilson's a potential top 10 wide receiver. But I think there's a pretty clear argument that Harrison could also end up in that top 10 range too, since I think his big thing last year was the uh, chemistry with his quarterback. He had a high target rate. He was seeing that volume that you wanted to see. Arizona really didn't make any changes to their offense. It's still the same competition for targets. So Harrison has Trey McBride to contend with, but we know an offense can have two receiving weapons and be fine. So Harrison has that. He just had the most uncatchable targets last year in terms of the rate of uncatchable targets to catchable targets was also among the top in the league. And it's something where we expect that to regress to the mean. We expect him to get more catchable targets this year. Just how much better is it going to get? Since even though each year it seems like we want Kyler Murray to improve, it's been a number of years now and he hasn't become one of those great quarterbacks. So, do we really expect Murray to get that much better at this point? So, even if Harrison's not at the bottom of the league, it still might not be great. So te for both wide receivers, we know they're good wide receivers. It's how good is their quarterback going to be? But I expect Wilson to just see that much more targets because he's not contending with someone else, where Harrison is contending with McBride.
Yeah, it's funny how like both New York teams really just have like their one very clear wide receiver, and both of these guys like should just get a lot of targets, right? And yeah, with Fields and Garrett Wilson, like I expect there to be a lot as well. Like Garrett Wilson, 152 targets last year. That was third most in the league. He had 6 games of double-digit targets, and then he had like a 21 target game in there as well. That was obviously it was before Devontae Adams arrived in Week 7, but before that point, Wilson led the league with 65 targets through 6 weeks, and that was with Aaron Rodgers at quarterback for sure. But then Marvin Harrison Jr. too, like he was top 20 at the position with 114 targets. But like you said, there were a lot of uncatchable targets in there. His uncatchable target rate was putrid, just 59.3%, which ranked I think only 8th percentile for his position last year. I wrote up an article very early in this offseason using like average fantasy production on an average catchable target rate. And it basically pointed that Marvin Harrison Jr. would have produced an additional 38.2 PPR points on the year, which was the biggest discrepancy among any wide receiver. So would have been a pretty big difference in his 2024 fantasy finish if he had just gotten average catchable targets thrown in his direction. So that is a big part of it for me. Like you said, just regressing to the mean there is absolutely possible and within the realm of possibilities for Marvin Harrison Jr. on top of just natural progression as a highly drafted player and a highly talented player coming out of college. Now, obviously Garrett Wilson, he was more efficient than Marvin Harrison Jr. last year. He was almost entirely like a product of his volume because his yards per route run, they were good, but they were only just inside the top 50 of wide receivers. Now, if he were to become more efficient with that level of opportunity that he got slash is projected to get, like you said, there's absolutely wide receiver one upside there for him, top 10 wide receiver at the very least. And I think, the same can be said about Marvin Harrison Jr., where we can slash maybe should project for a better season for Marvin Harrison Jr. as well, not just with a regression to the mean in terms of catchable target rate, but just natural progression again. Where, yeah, and I think drafters on Underdog at least are aware of that. That's why he's being drafted as a top 15 player or for his position right now. But then the one area that I found with, at least for Harrison Jr., where that there could be some regression that I think can be factored into his 2025 season based on what he did in 2024 is his touchdown production, specifically in the red zone. He scored 5 touchdowns on just 14 red zone targets. Meanwhile, Trey McBride, as we know, scored just 2 touchdowns on a much larger target share and volume, right? So there's definitely room for that to even out a little bit. I think it definitely has me more optimistic about Trey McBride as well. But yeah, we'll see how this shakes out here for Garrett Wilson specifically with Justin Fields at quarterback now. Like that's going to be one of the biggest differences. He'll go from Aaron Rodgers to Justin Fields, who was his quarterback at Ohio State. Now, like Fields, obviously he hasn't had the sustained success as a passer as Aaron Rodgers or even Kyler Murray, but Fields did support a fantasy wide receiver one for a full season as recently as 2023 with DJ Moore. So with enough volume, like there's absolutely hope for Garrett Wilson, especially considering that he only has to contend with like Alan Lazard, maybe. I don't even think he'll be on the team, and then Josh Reynolds in the passing game. So, yeah, this one I definitely lean towards Garrett Wilson as well. I think he should be the top target here for fantasy purposes between the two. Like there's just too much potential for volume. And even if he's slightly more efficient, where, he's better than just barely being able to crack the top 50 in yards per route run, like that could be a big boost in his favor as well. We just need Justin Fields to be competent, right? Which could definitely work out. And I really like Marvin Harrison Jr. this season. I wish he was a little bit more discounted right now in drafts where at least on underdog, right? Because I'd definitely be targeting him quite a bit. I think I'd just rather have Garrett Wilson right now.
I do think one thing that'll be interesting to see that we hopefully will get more information before the season starts is how much will Garrett Wilson be playing in the slot. The Jets completely changed their coaching staff. Offensive coordinator came from Detroit. When I was trying to figure out how they might try to use their wide receivers, it seemed like what made the most sense to me was for Garrett Wilson to play the Amon-Ra St. Brown role in the offense. Josh Reynolds has been in this offense before, so expect Josh Reynolds to be the X receiver. So I expect St. Brown to be that Z receiver in base offenses and the slot in three wide receiver sets. And St. Brown over his career has 1.97 yards per route run in the slot compared to 1.54 when lined up out wide. So he has played better in the slot. So if he's there a lot more this year, like you said, his efficiency isn't nearly as high as you would expect for someone with such a high target rate. I could see that efficiency going up just from him being used in that slightly different way than how the past offensive coordinators have been using him in New York. So I think that works to his advantage. Where I'll also be a little bit curious how much Harrison's playing in the slot since he was playing a little bit more there as the season progressed and it wasn't quite working out. They were using Michael Wilson also more in the slot, also not really working out. So I was a little surprised that they didn't try to bring in a slot receiver to this point or something like that to help stabilize the offense since Greg Dortch has played well in the past, but they seem to be moving away from him as the season went on.
Yeah, good point there. Yeah, there's definitely reason here to that we can get more excited behind both of these guys, I think. And yeah, I mean, Underdog has already kind of baked in a lot of that excitement and projection, I guess, for what these players can be in 2025. So yeah, but we'll see how other like Sleeper and places like that start to shake out with their ADP as well, because I think there could still be some value to get with both Garrett Wilson and Marvin Harrison Jr. this season. Okay, how about two wide receivers coming off very different seasons relative to, I'd say, their expectations, right? And that's Tyreek Hill, who is going as the wide receiver 15, and Terry McLaurin going as the wide receiver 16 in ADP. I realize that the graphic on the screen now doesn't have that correct, so I apologize for that. So Tyreek Hill is coming off his worst fantasy season since 2019, and McLaurin coming off the best fantasy season of his career. Right now, Hill was coming off back-to-back wide receiver 2 finishes and only finished as the wide receiver 18 this past year. So that has reset expectations for him, obviously, in 2025, which makes sense considering, he's entering year 10 in the league. He'll be 31 years old. But McLaurin will also be turning 30 this season, so he's not exactly a spring chicken either. But I think the thing with Hill is, and has been, that incredible efficiency on ideal volume, which I think, even this past year, he saw 121 targets. And while that was his lowest mark since 2019, it was still a 22.1% target rate, which was higher than McLaurin's 20.8%. It's not a massive difference, obviously, but it is part of the reason why these two are so close in ADP, despite coming off like these different trajectories based on how their values were at the start and finish of last season, right? It's worth noting too that McLaurin, his best season in terms of target rate, doesn't even surpass like Tyreek Hill's worst season in that regard. And now with more target competition in Washington, with Deebo Samuel coming in, I think exceeding that 2024 target rate for McLaurin becomes a little bit tougher. But the other bit that I'm sure we covered a fair bit last offseason was the potential for like a Tyreek Hill regression. It obviously delivered 3.82 yards per route run in 2023, which was the second best of the entire PFF era, behind only like 2008 Steve Smith. Now that regression hit really hard for Tyreek Hill. He delivered the worst mark of his entire career, 1.75 yards per route run, the first time he's ever posted below 2 yards per route run. Now, McLaurin, he hasn't been nearly as efficient in his career as Hill, but he did at least beat him in that regard this past year. And in a world of kind of, what have you done for me lately? That's at least a win. Now, McLaurin still isn't amazingly efficient, and I don't necessarily expect him to take this huge leap in 2025 efficiency either. But I think even when looking at McLaurin's touchdown totals, I think he's probably more likely to see some regression in his production as well. He finished with 13 touchdowns on the year, nearly double his previous season high for his career. And he delivered 10 of those touchdowns in the red zone on just 14 targets and 13 receptions, despite trailing Zach Ertz in total red zone targets and red zone target rate, which is going to be tough to sustain, especially with Ertz back and then, Deebo Samuel entering the mix. So this is like really kind of a case. I'll be interested how you kind of see it, Nate, because Tyreek Hill, I think as bad as last season was for in relative to his expectations, I think can kind of can bounce back a little bit this year. Where I think Terry McLaurin, as good as his season was relative to expectation, I think we could see a little bit more regression for him. So I'm curious how you're kind of viewing these two heading into 2025 right now.
Yeah, all the wide receivers that we've talked about so far, I have just a gap of like one or two spots in my rankings between them in terms of the wide receiver rankings. This one is a bit larger gap. I have Terry McLaurin as the better option this year. I am concerned that Tyreek Hill just might not ever recover from where he was.
Yeah.
He had a top 12 fantasy finish in 62 of his games in 2023. And last year it was 64% of the time he was a top 48 option at wide receiver. So he was a lot less dependable last year. And his game is entirely built off speed. And that's something you expect to regress as you age, where Terry McLaurin's game is completely built off of contested catches and being that X receiver who doesn't necessarily need that speed to be a great wide receiver. So he's gotten better over time as Washington's offense has gotten better. And with Hill, I know he's dealt with a lot of injuries in recent seasons. Last season, it was a wrist injury, but it seemed like it was more his speed and those kind of athletic things that were a problem more so than his wrist, even though he didn't have any reported any kind of leg injuries or foot injuries last year. So we saw a lower separation rate for him last year. We saw a lower deep target rate for him last year, a higher contested target rate, which you would expect if someone's not getting the same amount of separation. And at 31 years old and having had that speed for throughout his career, if he loses a little bit of that speed that his entire game is built on, then there goes his game. And we saw that a bit last year. I know he was dealing with the wrist injury, but he was able to still catch a decent percentage of the balls thrown his way, roughly what we would expect to see. So I don't know if the wrist injury really impacted him as much as the stats might show. So concerned about him that way. He also had more competition for targets last year. Johnny Smith was a better tight end than they've had in recent seasons. HN was able to get more involved in the passing game than running backs have gotten in the past in Miami. Jalen Waddle, another wide receiver who had a down season, more optimistic than that Waddle will be able to rebound. And like it seemed like Tyreek Hill wanted to get traded. It also doesn't seem like anyone has wanted to trade for him because they probably also think that he doesn't have the same ability that he once had. Where McLaurin, like he hasn't had that high end profile of a wide receiver in terms of efficiency, but he has been incredibly consistent for a wide receiver. Hasn't missed a game the last four seasons, always between 77 and 88 receptions, 900 to 1,200 receiving yards each year, a receiving grade somewhere in the 75 to 85 range. It's just the offense got a lot better last year, which helped him. Like you said, the touchdown rate probably isn't sustainable, which is probably baked into his ADP right now. He was a top 10 wide receiver last year. We're not expecting him to be a top 10 wide receiver this year. And I'd say a lot of that is because of the expected touchdown regression. I'm not as concerned about Debo Samuel being there, even though I am very excited about Samuel. But just knowing that Zach Ertz at his age isn't going to have a very high target rate. Austin Eckler, as the receiving back on the team, isn't going to have a high target rate at his age. Not overly concerned about any of the other wide receivers on the depth chart. So I think he can coexist with one other wide receiver. So excited about Samuel, even though I'm not worried about the two of them really competing for anything because they're very different wide receivers. The plays for them are going to be very different. I think those two coexisting will be fine. So for me, McLaurin is relatively safe. Yeah, he'll probably have a slightly worse season this year because he won't score as many touchdowns, but that's still probably good for a round wide receiver 15 or somewhere in that range where I could see Hill falling out of the top 20 wide receivers.
Yeah, you bring up like a very real concern with Tyreek Hill, right? Like where at this point in his career, yeah, like he may never get back to that super efficient, wide receiver that he once was. I do think there's probably a little bit more juice left to squeeze still with Tyreek Hill. Like I don't think he's too far off from Terry McLaurin. I'm with you though. I do agree that I think Terry McLaurin's still the better option right now. But I think about like this Miami offense too. Like they were down as a whole last year. I expect them to be a little bit better, but that also means that Jalen Waddle should also be able to bounce back a little bit, right? Creating a more tougher target competition than what Washington necessarily has to deal with, right? With Debo Samuel and Zach Ertz. But yeah, like there's the red zone, the touchdown stuff there with McLaurin, where I do think those touchdown numbers are going to come down, and Debo Samuel being added to the mix doesn't help that either, right? Like he ranks third among all wide receivers and tight ends in overall red zone touchdowns. So, or red zone touches, sorry, receptions and carries combined, that is, which again, if that trend continues, like it could take away a little bit more of that touchdown there potential from Terry McLaurin. So as much as these two, I think appear to be on these different paths and probably are on these different paths right now heading into 2025, I think they're relatively close. I don't think they're this close in ADP because even though I do expect regression for McLaurin and a slightly better season for Hill, I'm going to still lean Terry McLaurin here. I don't think Tyreek Hill's like, I don't want to say wide receiver one potential. I think, high end weekly potential is still there for him. Like he still has those big plays where, he can win you a week, but I don't think that's going to be as consistent or nearly as consistent as it once was. So yeah, I can definitely give the edge to Terry McLaurin here and probably have Tyreek Hill a little bit lower than where he's currently being drafted, like you said.
Yeah, and like when we're looking at underdog as well, like part of that is the ultra high looking
Yeah,
for upside. Tyreek Hill, if he goes back to being the same player he once was, he has the upside to be the number one overall
yeah,
wide receiver. I don't see Terry McLaurin being a top five fantasy wide receiver. I don't see that being in the range of possibilities unless a lot of wide receivers get hurt and you're looking at overall points rather than points per game. Then maybe McLaurin is able to get there. Where Tyreek Hill, we know he's been able to do that. I just don't see it happening this year.
yep, very fair. All right, last one. This time between a couple of wide receivers from the 2023 draft class. Jackson Smith-Njigba in Seattle is wide receiver 17 right now. Rashee Rice of the Kansas City Chiefs is wide receiver 18. Now, Nate, this is a really interesting one because JSN, we know, breakout season in 2024, finished as a top 10 fantasy wide receiver. And then Rashee Rice is coming off an ACL injury. There's potentially a suspension on the table, although that might be unlikely for 2025. But what he's shown when he's on the field is that he's a top tier fantasy wide receiver. So, where would you like to start with these two? Because I think there's intrigue and probably risk for both guys.
Yeah, I think both very interesting to talk about. Maybe the two most interesting
Yeah,
ones out of all the guys we've talked about so far, since they haven't been as consistent for one reason or another, and they're both projections for a lot of reasons. Smith Njigba, he is someone where I think underdog is around right where he should be, around that low wide receiver 17, 18 range, where I've seen him other places still among the top 12 or so wide receivers. And I think right after the season when I did my rankings, that's right around where I had him. But over the course of the offseason, that's gotten a bit lower.
sure.
Like you said, had that really good second half of last year. I think it was about a 7 game or so stretch, 8 game stretch where he had the second most fantasy points, but then ended on a little bit of a quiet note and then wasn't as strong the earlier parts of the season. But I think the changes to Seattle this offseason have a really big impact on Smith and Jigba's fantasy value. They added Clint Kubiak as their new offensive coordinator, moved on from Metcalf and Tyler Lockett. Kubiak has spent the last 4 seasons with 4 different teams: Vikings offensive coordinator, Broncos passing game coordinator and quarterback coach, 49ers passing game coordinator, and Saints offensive coordinator. So we've really been able to see like what kind of things are true to Kubiak versus true to just an offense in general because he's hopped around so much. And none of those offenses really feature their slot receiver all that much. The only one to have over 500 yards from the slot was Jerry Judy in one of those years with Denver at 519 yards, where Smith-Njigba had 993 of his yards come from the slot last year. So he's going to have to play a bit more outside wide receiver. They've talked a lot about having their offense through the run game. They've uh, turned 2 of their tight ends into fullbacks. So we should be getting a lot of 12 personnel, a lot of 21 personnel where there's not typically a slot receiver on the field. So Smith-Njigba will have to be on the outside for those kind of plays. Cooper Cup was added to the team, another slot receiver, and their offenses have not just gone through the run game, but have gone through deeper passes. So all of the wide receivers that have done well in Kubiak's offense generally have a higher average depth of target. Anyone who's been a top 25 fantasy wide receiver in those last four offenses has had an average depth of target of 12 or higher. And then they add in Cooper Cup, who has also been a low average depth of target slot receiver. So they're going to have to find ways to coexist in the offense when they aren't going to have slot receivers very much. We've also added Marquez Valdes-Scantling, who had experience in Kubiak's offense last year with the Saints. Um, and had some success on deep passes there, which is kind of where the offense generally finds success. Torrey Horton, another wide receiver they've added. All of them are better blockers than Smith-Njigba as well. So I'm also worried that even though he earned those snaps in 12 personnel last year, he might lose a lot of those snaps this year because Cooper Cup, even though he's been a slot receiver primarily, he has also been a fairly decent blocker as a wide receiver, especially for a slot receiver. So I could see Cooper Cup almost being more likely to have those snaps in those two wide receiver sets. So even before we get to Rashee Rice, I'd be curious to see what you have to add on Smith-Njigba.
Yeah, I think you bring up a lot of good points because it's true. Like, how is he going to react to another new offensive dynamic, right? Like, which has been the case now for all three of his NFL off seasons, where he's got new coach or offensive coordinator or a new quarterback. This year, a new quarterback and a new offensive coordinator, as well as another wide receiver starting next to him. So I don't know that. Yeah, I think there are a lot of questions about Jackson Smith-Njigba. Like, will he continue to kind of establish himself as that top wide receiver in Seattle? Will he take a step back? Will he share the load with Cup? Is there even enough to go around if Sam Darnold, who we didn't even talk about, like, isn't able to replicate like his breakout 2024 season in a new offensive system himself? So there's a lot of questions about JSN that, the same could be said about Rice as well, but completely different questions with Jackson Smith-Njigba specifically. So yeah, I'm with you. I think he should be lower than where he's currently being drafted. Not too much lower because I still like him. I think Jackson Smith-Njigba still going to be the top player in that offense. But for me, even with the questions with Rashee Rice, I think there's more to be optimistic of, I think, about right now, where even considering that he'll have to bounce back from an ACL injury, which is no guarantee to do, especially right away. And obviously if he can continue to avoid suspension, like, as far as injury recovery goes, like, that happened in, I think, late September last year, and he seems to be on pace for a week 1 return, barring any major setback, right? But for the suspension stuff, from what I can tell, like, the case hasn't been concluded yet, so the NFL could be waiting on that. And apparently, the legal system just takes a really long time to sort this stuff out. So by the time the NFL gets all the info they need, a suspension might not make sense until 2026. Now, keep in mind, as many of you might be surprised to hear, I am not a legal expert. Shocking, I know, but from what I can gather, at least, like, that is kind of my version of like law school for dummies. But I'm sure we'll get much better, more informed information as the year progresses. Now, if Rice is able to get on the field for week 1 and play an entire season, there's so much encouraging data to say that he is Patrick Mahomes' top wide receiver, top receiver overall, and not just by a little, but by a pretty significant margin. And I think he should be probably ranked even higher than wide receiver 18 if that's going to be the case, because you look at his efficiency metrics and they are elite across the board, including 3.16 yards per route run last season, 16.2 fantasy points per game, 32% target rate, 26.7% target rate in the red zone, 18.7 first down plus touchdown rate. Rice was a great value last year in drafts, even as news became clearer that he wasn't going to get suspended. And if he didn't get hurt, he was on a wide receiver 1 pace. So while it might take some time to get back up to speed coming off injury, I tend to have full confidence that Rice can return to that elite level in 2025, obviously barring suspension / injury setback and stuff like that. So I think you brought up all the right points there with Jackson Smith-Njigba. still reason to be hopeful for him here in year 3, but I think when comparing him to someone like Rashi Rice, again, assuming that the suspension stuff doesn't go through, I think there's a bigger gap here than the ADP would say.
Oh yeah, like I agree with you with the suspension. Andrew Davenport at Football Guys is kind of the guy I go to for the legal stuff because I am by no means a legal expert whatsoever, but he has a lot more background in that kind of stuff. His most recent update at the lack of movement in the case, since the case really hasn't moved at all in several months now. We're basically where we were last year, where the longer we go without news, the less likely he'll get suspended this year because the league will wait for the legal process to play out, and it is still playing out and not moving. So, the suspension part, not worried about. I am concerned about the LCL tear. Hopefully he's ready for week 1, but hopefully he's back to 100% is probably the bigger thing, since even though we expect him to play this weekend, or not this weekend, this season, we want him to be at 100%. And there's been various levels of guys coming back from injuries. If they're back to 100% right away, if it takes a season for them. So for me, that's probably the biggest concern for Rice is just that injury recovery and if he's going to be back to 100%. But then it's also Xavier Worthy played so well at the end of last season, and he played so well largely in Rice's role of that very low average depth of target, playing a lot in the slot. And it'll be interesting to see how the snaps shake out between them. How Kansas City, I know before last year, they were thinking they wanted to have a lot more deep targets, and that didn't quite play out because Hollywood Brown was injured for almost all the season. Worthy didn't wasn't as successful in that kind of role as they were expecting, so they moved Worthy to more of that role that Rashee Rice was playing. So now they have both of those wide receivers and they need to coexist. And luckily for Kansas City, we know they are perfectly comfortable moving their wide receivers around, having them line up in different spots, having them do different things. So there will be plays where Rice has that role. There will be plays where Worthy has that role. And that was true each of the last 2 years when these wide receivers have had success in that role. So we know they be able to at least somewhat coexist. So even though I have concern there, it's not nearly as concerning as what we were just talking about with Cooper Cup and how is he going to coexist. Maybe one of them will become the slot receiver and the other will have to play completely outside. Maybe not. We'll see how it ends up going. But we know the two will be able to coexist in Kansas City somewhat. Not as concerned about Travis Kelsey because his play is declining at this point. Was going through like the projections at PFF, was going through the rankings, and it's hard to see him having the same kind of season. He's another player that just at his age and based on how well he played last year, for Kelsey, a lot of it was what he could no longer do after the catch. His avoided tackle rate completely plummeted last year. His yards after the catch per catch plummeted. So I know a lot of people were talking about what he was able to do with separation and those kind of things. And I think he was mostly fine-ish there, but it was really what he could do after the catch. And that's what Kansas City's offense is built on, is receivers doing stuff after the catch, which is what Rashee Rice does and what Worthy was doing late last season. So I think Rice and Worthy can coexist. It's just still concerned about the injury, so I'm not as optimistic about Rice as I'd like to be, but I have Rice right around where Underdog has him right now.
Yeah, I think it makes sense, right? Until we get closer to the season and we could get a better idea of kind of what the expectations are for someone like Rice, especially. I think we can temper expectations at this point in the off season, right? Where yeah, if he's full go for week 1, I think there's more reason to be optimistic. But you're right. Yeah, I think Xavier Worthy. I think he did play well, especially into the playoffs last year in that kind of lower A dot type role underneath, playing in that Rashi Rice role. I do still think that role will go to Rice if he's fully healthy, or at least more so, where Worthy might revert back to a little bit more of the deep threat there. Travis Kelsey maybe still poses some threat, like in the red zone, those high scoring areas of the field, but like you said, declining here at this point in his career, so it's not as big of a concern. So Kansas City, look, we know this offense, there's plenty to go around. Like even still, like this is a team that ranks 3rd in the regular season in pass rate since 2022 at 65%. Top 10 graded quarterback every single year with Patrick Mahomes. And Rice, whenever he's been on the field, at least has been kind of the focal point of that passing attack. So I don't think, like, if he's healthy and not suspended, I don't think that'll change too much in 2025. So Yeah, I'm still going to go Rice here. Again, assuming the injury suspension stuff is not a concern. But yeah, I think drafting right now, there's definitely some risk. As we get closer to the season, without suspension news, that risk continues to fade a little bit, and Rice's ADP should hopefully rise a little bit as a result, or maybe not. Hopefully, if we want to try to scoop him up for a better value, but still like Jackson Smith-Njigba a fair bit. But I agree, like the target competition, the change in offense. There's a lot that he's going to have to kind of be dealing with here. And then not even to mention if Sam Darnold, can't get back to what he was in 2024 with the Vikings that got him this contract. He didn't look great at the end of last season, so there's risk there as well.
To comment off what you said with the Chiefs, with Travis Kelce, like that, the fact that he's a red zone threat helps Rice probably more than hurts him because teams so much double
Yeah,
Kelsey in the red zone. There was only one play last year where the Chiefs were close to scoring and Kelsey was in the end zone and was targeted because teams focus so much on Kelsey that it just frees up everyone else in the
sure.
offense to score points. So, assuming defenses still treat Kelsey the same way in the red zone, that's actually a good thing.
Yeah.
And then
Yes.
also with the injury, like, I don't care if Rice plays week 1 or not, as long as he's playing by October, that's fine. But also, like, the important thing is how well is he playing? And we're probably not gonna know that until he actually starts playing. Because like,
Yeah.
last year, Nick Chubb was ready to play in the middle of the season, and even though he was ready to play, he was not ready to be the same player that he was before the injury. He was just ready to play football again. So, like, even if Rice is ready to go week 1, we don't know if that's going to be Rice, the same Rice we saw last year, or just a version of Rice that is good enough to play football, but not good enough to be this elite receiver that we saw at the start of last year.
Yeah.
And
Very,
we
very
won't know
true.
that.
Sorry.
And we won't know that until he actually starts playing.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely right. And then look, the Chiefs' offense is going to operate at a high level with or without him. They have other options, Xavier Worthy and Marquise Hollywood Brown, who they brought back as well, guys that can still be capable starters to buy time until Rashee Rice is up to speed. So it won't be a rush for them. They're obviously going to be looking to make a playoff run, so they'll want him to be as healthy as possible as well. So there's all kinds of stuff to kind of factor in here. It's just a matter of what your process is going to be and who you're going to like more. But hopefully that helps you guys kind of make some decisions, because that's going to wrap it up for us for today. Hopefully you enjoyed that, because yeah, next week we'll be breaking down some running back battles as well, Nate. So thank you all for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe if you're on the YouTube, but greatly appreciate that. Nate, thank you to you as always. And please do remind everybody what you have going on at pff.com this week.
Oh, yeah, like we said at the start of the show, been grinding out the player profiles, 3 of them a day, every day. Have been doing it for nearly a month now, and we'll be doing it for the rest of June as well. And then once we get to the end of June, we'll start going through a lot of other content that you expect for the start of the fantasy season, even though that's still 2 months ahead of a lot of fantasy drafts. But once we hit July and I've gone through all of the players that'll be fantasy relevant this year, we'll start digging deeper into draft strategy, more rankings, more sleepers and breakouts and those kind of players. And then we're only a couple months away from preseason recaps, which the Hall of Fame game is in July this year. So we will have the first ever July fantasy football recap this year.
Man, yeah, excited. So yeah, it's gonna creep up on us really quickly, obviously. But yeah, for me, I've written up all of these wide receiver battles that we've talked about today for the site. They're all up now, plus a couple more, and they're free. So check those out and dig into the interactive target maps for each player as well, which are included in the article. But yeah, if you enjoy this talk, I'll put out a short form video version on YouTube with some bonus wide receiver battles probably next week. So be on the lookout for that. And until next time, peace out.